Howdy and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trentano. Leading us in, as always, with their rendition of Eno Marconi's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar singers like you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. Tonight, the Cowboy versus Nazi action continues in Chapter 11 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trentano. You can get a copy today at ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts and sweaters are also available at Society6.com/Trentano. Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts and sweaters are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And as always, I'd like to thank James K. Doyle for lending us his time and talent to the podcast. He really brings Paris High Noon alive. So without further ado, here's Chapter 11 of Paris High Noon.
Chapter 11, Shootout. Jean rode the piebald mare east down a narrow wooded ravine towards a small hamlet nestled in the rolling collines de Perche, east of Gassé. Patrice followed on a chestnut trotter with a string of 3 ponies carrying supplies. Now that they had horses, Catfish planned on robbing the bank in Argentan. Although no one was eager to ride into the middle of a town filled with gun-toting Nazis, that's where the money was. Catfish assigned the gang their chores. St. Jude, Jacques, Hammer, and Louis were keeping an eye on the town, taking note of the soldiers' comings and goings. Catfish and Barnaby went out to scavenge up guns and ammo, while Quick Billy kept watch at the hideout. That left Jean and Patrice to ride a wide circle around the Norman countryside, gathering up supplies in the small villages for the long ride to the Spanish border. At first, Jean was apprehensive, but his confidence was growing as much as his horsemanship. Patrice rode up next to Jean. "How long do you think it will take us to get to the border?" he asked his pard. "I figure it would be a 2-day train ride from Paris," Jean said. "On foot, it could take a whole month. And with the Boche on our heels? Well, that might quicken our pace a little." Patrice let out a laugh and Jean joined in. Both boys were scared, and yet found an unexpected bliss as they took on the world together. They tied off the horses in the thick woods about a mile from town. Patrice took the MP40 from the saddle and slung it over his shoulder, while Jean tucked the revolver behind his back in a special holster Catfish rigged together with a broken bridle. They stopped behind a stone wall next to the road leading into town. Lanterns burning outside cafes and bars wrapped the street in a warm glow. At one cafe, a gaggle of soldiers lounged easily with giggling petite amies. Patrice gripped the submachine gun and charged the bolt. "I'll keep you covered." Jean nodded, pulled down his hat, buttoned up his jacket, and stepped out onto the road. Jean passed the cafe with the soldiers and walked into the store next door, where an old man was putting up the closed sign. "Come back tomorrow," the man said in a gravelly voice. "We're closed." "Please, monsieur," Jean said innocently. "I've come all the way from Vimatours. My mother is sick, and the store burned out. I just need a few things, and I'll be on my way." The old man looked at Jean through his thick glasses and tugged at his bushy gray mustache. "I don't give out credit." Jean flashed his wad of bills, and the old man's face brightened. "Well, looks like we have a young duke." He flipped the sign back to open. "Please come in and help yourself. What is it that you wish to purchase?" Jean handed their list to the old man, who hustled around the store gathering the most expensive items. "This is a top-quality oil lamp, finest kerosene. It's expensive due to rationing, but for the right price, it could be yours." Jean was amazed at how the old man suddenly respected him when he pulled out his money. He understood now why his brother had turned to crime. It occurred to Jean that maybe if he stole enough money, Moo would look on him in a more favorable light. The old man showed him each item and praised its worth. "That will do just fine," Jean said with a swagger in his voice. The door swung open, and in walked two Germans with their rifles slung across their backs. Their breath stunk of wine, sausage, and cigarettes. "Hey, old man," said one in horrible French. "You got any sweets?" The other soldier, a young man with lazy eyes, laughed. "You going to try and buy a whore with candy? Not only are you drunk, but stupid, too. Give me some candy or I'll break your stupid shop into 1,000 pieces." The old man put the basket on the counter, grabbed a large paper sack, and filled it with treats. While he was doing this, the soldier with the lazy eyes looked into Jean's basket. "All this stuff is yours, boy?" Suddenly, the weight of the revolver hanging on Jean's backside felt like he'd just crapped an anvil. His instincts told him to try for the pistol and shoot his way out. But even if he were able to gun down these two soldiers, the ones outside the cafe would get him for sure. "It's for my sick mother and Vimateurs," Jean said with a croak in his voice. Whatever confidence he had ran out the door as soon as the soldiers walked in. "Your mother must be a whore to afford all this stuff," the soldier said, picking up the bottle of wine. "Hey, Gerhard," he said in German, "maybe you should see this boy's mother if you're looking for a whore." The other soldier said nothing, but did look into the basket. "Are you paying cash for all of this?" "Yes, monsieur. It's all the money we have left. My mother is very sick, and we need these supplies." The soldier snorted. "This old bastard is surely charging your mother an arm and a leg." He looked at the old shopkeeper. "You better not overcharge me, old man, or I'll beat you on credit." "Maybe he's part of the gang of killers and thieves that stole the general's horse," the lazy-eyed soldier said with a chuckle. A cold sweat broke out over Jean's forehead. The revolver now felt like a mountain sitting on the ridge of his ass, dragging him to the center of the earth. The other soldier laughed. "This one? He couldn't cut warm butter with that soft face." He turned his red-rimmed eyes on the clerk. "How much?" "Oh, just a centime," the old man said as he handed over the 1-franc bag. "I think I'll take this bottle of wine," the lazy-eyed soldier said. "I doubt your sick mother needs it much." He laughed, and the two walked out. The old shopkeeper, still trembling, turned to Jean. "You'll still have to pay for that bottle they took." Jean threw the wad of bills on the counter, grabbed the basket, and left. Outside in the lamplight, the two soldiers that were in the store were eating candy and talking to some Norman farm girls. The lazy-eyed soldier put his stare on. Jean threw the wad of francs on the counter, grabbed the basket, and left. Outside in the lamplight, the two soldiers that were in the store were eating candy and talking to some Norman farm girls. The lazy-eyed soldier put his stare on Jean, who kept his head down and his feet moving. "Hey," the lazy-eyed soldier yelled at Jean. "Isn't Vimateurs the other way?" Jean didn't stop, nor did he pick up his pace. The lazy-eyed soldier called out again, walking toward Jean. "I was talking to you." He grabbed Jean by the shoulder and spun him around. Jean dropped the basket and went for his revolver. The lazy-eyed soldier looked dumbstruck as Jean shoved the barrel into his belly and pulled the trigger. A flash flickered in the small space between the two men, the report muffled by the soldier's tunic. The German fell forward, almost knocking Jean down before crumpling to the ground. The second soldier stood stunned, absorbing the situation into his alcohol-soaked brain. He went for his rifle slung on his back, but it was no use. Jean raised the barrel of the revolver square at the soldier's chest and fired. At the cafe, the rest of the soldiers jumped up out of their chairs, knocking over ashtrays and spilling beer and wine on the petite amies. One of them shouted and pointed at Jean, who was running for the stone wall. About a half-dozen bolted for him, pointing their shooting irons his way. A submachine gun roared from the bramble and cut down the soldiers in mid-stride. Jean jumped over the stone wall and made a run for the horses. He broke through the brush as the gunshots pierced the night. Patrice rode up fast with the rest of the horses in tow, almost knocking Jean down with the piebald mare. "What the hell just happened?" he said. His eyes were wide and his breath shallow. Jean swung himself up in the saddle and grabbed the reins. I'll explain later. Jean took point with the pack horses in the middle and Patrice riding drag to make sure none fell behind. They rode as fast as they dared through the forest, where the tree canopy blocked out the starlight. Branches scrapped and scratched, almost knocking them down. Jean rode hunched over, his heavy breathing matching the wind coming out of the piebald. He knew the terrain well enough to get them back to Troen-l'Amour before sunrise. It was a risk riding straight for the hideout, but it was their only chance. They broke out of the forest. Ahead lay a large open field out in the middle by a raised dirt road. To the north, about a dozen headlights jumped and flashed like a swarm of drunken lightning bugs, the sound of humming engines carried in the wind. Jean looked at Patrice. We have to cross that field before those lights hit the road. Can't we wait until they pass us by? Jean shook his head. What if they post some guards on the road? We'll be caught on this side of the valley come daylight, and then we'll be in a tougher spot than we're in now. Jean took the reins of the two pack horses, with Patrice taking the third. Jean put his hand on Patrice's shoulder. If anything happens to me, head for the hideout and tell the others what happened. I'll try to keep them busy as long as I can. Patrice shook his head. You know I can't do that. May not have a choice. The outlaws looked at the posse of headlights getting bigger and bigger. Jean spurred the piebald. 5 horses ran down the hillside towards the road. The thunder of their hooves drummed across the dark valley. A low hedge blocked the rise to the road. Jean kept the pace, digging his spurs into the piebald's flanks. The horse jumped the hedge like a frog, as did the rest of the horses. Bred for tracks and steeplechases, the mounts were in their element. Patrice almost lost the reins, but was able to hold onto the saddle horn. They crossed the road in under a second, then dipped down off the shoulder and into another line of bocage. Again the horses jumped over the scrub like Pegasus taking flight. Just as they cleared the last line of hedges, one of Jean's pack horses took a tumble, pulling the other 2 horses down. Rider and mounts went ass over tit. The piebald and the second pack horse got right to their feet. They snorted, shook off the fall, and continued to gallop for the woods, leaving Jean sucking wind on his backside. When the piebald passed Patrice with an empty saddle, he wheeled his horse around. Up on the road he could see the outlines of the vehicles, 3 Kubelwagens and 2 trucks bearing down the road they just crossed. Patrice let loose the rein of his pack horse and smacked it on the rump, sending it galloping towards the trees. He spurred his mount and rode back to Jean. Jean was up, but his head was in a spin. The pack horse that took a tumble was still down, thrashing and screaming. He'd drawn his revolver to put the poor creature out of its misery when Patrice rode up. We have to go, he said, nodding towards the road. Jean nodded his head and was about to jump up behind Patrice, but the cries of the pack horse unnerved him. We can't leave the poor creature like this, Jean said. Patrice held out his hand. We don't have time. Jean held the revolver. The iron never felt so heavy in his hand. The Boche will hear its cries and come up this way. Jean said, if they're not complete imbeciles, they'll see our tracks. Patrice pointed at Jean's revolver. They'll have to be deafer than hell not to hear a shot. Jean tucked away the revolver and pulled out a clasp knife. He ran over to the pack horse, whose hooves cut the air, approaching him from its blind side. Jean put a knee on the horse's neck and another on its head. He thrust the small blade into the horse's jugular and sliced it open. Blood sprayed out into the grass, mixing with dew. The horse thrashed and Jean cut until it thrashed no more. Jean got up and ran back to Patrice. Up on the road he could hear the engines idling. Patrice held out his arm, and Jean swung up behind him. Patrice dug in the spurs, and the horses took off at full gallop towards the woods. Once safely under the cover of the forest, Jean told Patrice to stop. We have to find the other horses before the Boche do. They rode in a counterclockwise loop. After 5 minutes, a low chorus of nickers broke the dark silence. Patrice's horse nickered back. Jean swung off the saddle and found the piebald mare, which shied away from the smell of blood on Jean's hands. "It's okay," Jean whispered and patted the mare on the neck. "I'm not going to hurt you." The piebald swung her head and Jean saddled up. He grabbed the reins of one pack horse and Patrice the other. "All right," Jean said. "Let's hope we get back to the hideout without any more bad luck." They rode fast and quiet through the forest. Every now and then they could see headlights through the trees. Jean had stirred up a hornet's nest. He wondered if he'd done the right thing in gunning down the two Germans back at the village. Jean and Patrice hit the rille just as the eastern sky was beginning to light up. There were no headlights, but they could hear the hum of engines off in the distance. Jean had to suppress the urge to gallop at full speed, but he took his time reaching the cut. About 50 feet from the entrance, an owl hoot that sounded more like a chicken squawk disturbed the fading night. Jean responded by giving 2 hoots. Seconds later, Quick Billy came out from the brush, the MP-40 shaking in his hands. "I'm glad to see you, boys. Ever since Hammer and Louis came back from their watch, it seems like every Boche in France has come out of the woodwork." "Is Catfish here?" Jean asked. "No," Quick Billy said, "but I wish he was. St. Jude and Hammer are having it out. If the Boche don't kill 'em, they'll do each other in." Back at camp, the fire was out, and he couldn't see anyone. One of the horses nickered. "Get those fucking horses inside the overhang," St. Jude whispered loudly from the shadows. The 2 boys got their horses under the overhang with the rest of the remuda and the milk cow. All of the horses were saddled and ready to go, though where they could ride off to if the Germans showed up was anyone's guess. The milk cow seemed disinterested in the commotion, calmly chewing her cud. Patrice stayed with the horses while Jean picked up an MP-40 and a couple of extra magazines. Most of the supplies for the trail to Spain were piled up in boxes and sacks. The gang figured if they had to ride, they would ride lean and fast to get to Vichy. Even there it wouldn't be safe. Pétain would let the Nazis ride in so they could ride roughshod through the countryside looking for them. The only safe place was Spain. A long ride with the devil's horde on their trail. Jean groped around in the darkness looking for his brother. It didn't take him long to follow the whispered accusations coming from a clump of bushes. "This is all your fault, you fat, stupid fool," St. Jude said to a large, dark shadow across from him. "Go fuck yourself," Hammer whispered back. "I'm telling you for the last time, no one followed me and Louis back from Argentan." "So, how is that as soon as you come in, the Boche almost fell right into our hideout?" Hammer cursed back at St. Jude. He was manning the big MG-34 and might have used it on St. Jude if the roar wouldn't bring 100 gunfighting Nazis to them. Jean touched St. Jude's shoulder. His brother jumped, as if he'd heard the trumpeting of the angels. "Fucking Christ," St. Jude said, in his lowest shout. His grip on the MP-40 was so tense it could have torn the gun in 2. Jean wasn't too sure how to tell St. Jude that it was his fault the Wehrmacht were there on the hunt for them. He figured he made a mistake by shooting it out with the 2 soldiers, but from Jean's point of view, he had no choice. Somehow, though, he doubted St. Jude would agree. Jean opened his mouth, but nothing came out. St. Jude leaned into his brother's ear. "Hurry up and declare, or get to the other side of the rim and cover the north side." Jean cleared his throat. It was like Catfish said, sometimes you got no choice but to put on your best boots and step in shit. It wasn't Hammer's fault that the Boche are onto us. It was me. St. Jude grabbed Jean by the jacket arm and pulled him in close. "What?" Jean told him what happened back in the village with the 2 drunk soldiers, coloring it to suit his case that he had no choice but to pull iron. "Fuck," was all St. Jude could say. A beam of cold light cut the light purple sky above them, followed by a few more. Snaps of branches and low curses came from just above the outlaws. Everyone in the pit gripped their guns so tight they almost cut themselves on the metal. The snaps and cracks got louder and more lights swirled around. Suddenly someone shouted, followed by a chorus of screams and yells. The lights turned away from them. For the next 10 minutes they heard commotion up top. Then as quickly as they came, the Germans left. Jean let out his breath. Above, the morning calls of songbirds filled the dark blue sky. A voice that filled the hideout called out from behind them. "Close one, wasn't it? The Boche are thicker than ticks on a hound." The gang almost jumped out of their boots. They turned around to see Catfish and Barnaby heading their horses up the creek. "That must have been the biggest posse I ever seen," Catfish said. "Kind of makes you feel important." Jean ran up and wrapped his arms around the old cowboy. Tears came out of his eyes and his throat choked up. "Whoa, son," Catfish said with a smile. "You miss me that much, I sure hope you don't drop down on your knees and propose." The gang let out an uneasy laugh. Jean let out a large, snot-filled sniffle. "It was my fault," he said, and told Catfish how it went down back at the village. Catfish put his arm on the boy's sagging shoulder. "Sounds like you don't have much of a choice in the matter. What happened to you could have happened to any of us. That Boche was trying to get something on you, and if he couldn't find it honestly, he'd have made it another way. Believe you me, I know the type." The weight Jean had been carrying felt a little lighter. The boy accepted his responsibilities and took on the consequence as much as any man could. He was lucky. They were all lucky that the Germans didn't find them. How long that luck was going to hold was anyone's guess, and they didn't want to hang around to find out. Catfish looked at Jean. "It's not important how you got into a scrape. Getting out of it is. You kept a cool head and took chances only when you had to." The rest of the gang grunted in agreement. St. Jude walked over to Catfish. "Speaking of getting out of scrapes, what do we do now?" Catfish took a look around. "Well, we can't stay here, that's for sure." "So we ride for Vichy?" St. Jude asked. "But what about the bank job in Argentan?" Hammer said. "Even if we get to Spain, we'll starve like beggars without any money." Catfish smiled. He patted one of the crates of dynamite strapped over the back of his saddle. "Lucky for us, I was able to pick up the last item on the list." Hammer looked at the boxes. "Is that enough?" "It'll do." Catfish got the gang working on rigging up as much of the supplies as they could carry at a fast gallop. By mid-afternoon, they had finished their last meal at Trou and Lamour, burning and breaking what they couldn't carry. They had collected a fair arsenal of submachine guns and pistols along with the big MG-34. They'd hoped to have one more week. As more and more Wehrmacht convoys left for their side of the Rhine every day, Catfish got the gang working on rigging up as much supplies as they could carry at a fast gallop. By mid-afternoon, they had finished their last meal at Trou and Lamour, burning and breaking what they couldn't carry. They had collected a fair arsenal of submachine guns and pistols along with the big MG-34. They'd hoped to have one more week. As more and more Wehrmacht convoys left for their side of the Rhine every day, now they had to take whatever the town of Argentan had to offer, if they wanted that money. There were no more signs or sounds of the Germans, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. At dusk, Catfish slipped out to see if the trail was clear. He spotted a few patrols, but as long as they stayed in the woods, he figured they could avoid the soldiers and make it to the outskirts of Argentan before morning. Night had fallen by the time Catfish returned. He saddled the Arabian and put him in the lead. "All right, boys, we got a long 24 hours ahead of us, and tougher days after that. Everyone stay focused, and before you know it, you'll have all the sun, sangria, and senoritas that you can handle." The gang let out a low grumble. Surprise is still on our side, Catfish said. As long as we don't get spotted, we'll be in good shape to rob the bank and get away with as much money as we can carry. Everybody got it? There was a murmur of agreement. Catfish led them out of True and Lemur and into the dark woods. Behind them, the milk cow bayed.
And welcome back to the Strange West podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. And that about does it for the Cowboys versus Nazi action in Paris High Noon. Can't wait to find out what happens next? Then get your ebook copy at parishighnoon.com, or if you prefer the paperback, parishighnoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts and sweaters are available through society6.com/Trentano. Paris High Noon and the mustache t-shirts and sweaters are available at society6.com/Trentano. Big thanks to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. And sending us out, as always, with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. Check them out at mitchpolzak.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Happy trails.